In a quiet countryside town in Pennsylvania, where the wind rustled gently through rows of old trees and golden sunlight bathed historic rooftops, lived a man named Richard Baumhammers. To neighbors and acquaintances, Richard was a familiar figure, a quiet man, polite, living with his parents in the family home. However, beneath that seemingly calm exterior lay a mind increasingly fractured. Richard was never quite like his peers. From a young age, he exhibited strange signs, not just shyness or introversion, but a deep self-imposed isolation that set him apart from society. During his teenage years, his insecurity and sense of abandonment grew stronger. Richard wasn't a failure in academics. In fact, he had studied at prestigious universities, traveled to Europe, and even lived abroad for a short time. But these accomplishments couldn't fill the psychological void inside him. Over the years, Richard began to believe the world was against him, and that all his suffering was caused by others, by people he saw as the root of all his tragedies. Extreme ideas started to take root in his mind, gradually consuming all his thoughts. What made things more dangerous was that Richard had been diagnosed with a mental illness, specifically paranoid schizophrenia. Instead of receiving treatment and support, most of his symptoms were overlooked or downplayed, until the worst happened. April 28, 2000, began like any other ordinary day in the quiet suburbs of Pittsburgh. But within a matter of hours, a nightmare named Richard Baumhammers would shake the entire state of Pennsylvania to its core. Around noon, tensions flared in the Baumhammers household. Richard, 34 at the time, had a heated argument with his parents. But this time, instead of retreating to his room, he went to the basement, where his parents kept a handgun locked in a cabinet. Without warning, he approached his mother in the kitchen. He raised the gun and fired. The first bullet ended the life of the woman who gave birth to him, a cold-blooded act that even mental health experts later struggled to understand. But Richard didn't stop there. Armed with the gun, he got into a silver SUV and began a killing spree that lasted nearly 90 minutes across multiple counties. At every stop, every time he exited his vehicle, another racially motivated murder occurred. The first victim was a Jewish man outside his synagogue, shot while getting into his car. Next, Richard walked into an Indian-owned grocery store, pretending to shop before suddenly firing at the store owner, killing him instantly. The carnage continued: a Chinese-owned store, a Thai restaurant. All the victims were from minority communities: Jewish, Asian, Arab. His choice of targets revealed a clear motive of racial hatred, a series of attacks aimed not just at individuals, but at the communities they represented. Along his rampage, Richard also spray-painted Nazi swastikas and anti-immigrant slogans on a synagogue wall. These actions were unmistakable signs of the deeply rooted hatred that had poisoned his mind for years. By late afternoon, after killing 6 people and injuring several others, Richard returned near his home. Police, after hours of searching, subdued and arrested him without resistance. It seemed he had completed his mission, a horrifying indictment of a society that once appeared peaceful. To understand Richard Baumhammer's path of bloodshed, one must return to the years when his personality was forming, when his mind first began to fracture, and hatred quietly took root. Born in 1965, Richard grew up in a middle-class family in suburban Pittsburgh. His father was a respected dentist, and his mother had been a teacher. They lived in a nice house, with a garden and a car, an American dream. But from adolescence, Richard always felt different, isolated, and socially disconnected. Classmates recalled him as a quiet boy who often sat alone in class, sometimes going an entire day without saying a word. Although academically above average, his eyes reflected a deep sadness, and a distance that even teachers couldn't bridge. He didn't play sports or have close friends. After school, while others played games or hung out, Richard went home, retreated into his room, and immersed himself in books, especially those about war history, fascism, and extreme nationalist movements. After high school, Richard studied international politics in college. On the surface, it seemed promising. But in reality, this was when his radical views began to fully emerge. College classmates recalled that Richard frequently debated politics, but his views became increasingly extreme. He openly distrusted the U.S. government, condemned immigrants, and believed Western culture's purity was being destroyed. Some professors even called him in for private talks, concerned about his mental health, but nothing was done because he had never acted out publicly. After college, Richard studied abroad in Austria and Germany, where he further immersed himself in far-right nationalist ideology. Reports later showed that he had connections with neo-Nazi groups and collected racially charged propaganda. During that time, his mental illness also worsened. He began speaking to himself, writing incoherent journals, and obsessing over being followed or mind-controlled. His parents took him to a psychiatrist, who diagnosed him with paranoid schizophrenia. However, since he wasn't violent at the time, he wasn't hospitalized long-term. He was released with a prescription for medication. Unfortunately, Richard refused treatment. He believed the doctors were part of a conspiracy, injecting him with Jewish poisons. He became more defiant, closed off, and increasingly hateful toward foreigners, especially Asians and Jews. For years, Richard lived between two worlds, one where he had a loving family and a safe home, and another, an imaginary one, where immigrants were enemies, society was collapsing, and he, Richard, was chosen to cleanse America. And then, in the year 2000, the day of reckoning came. When reason could no longer restrain him, when hatred breached all moral boundaries, Richard Baumhammers took up arms and executed his version of a cleansing, ruthless, deranged, and inhumane. The morning of April 28, 2000, began under a gloomy Pennsylvania sky, perhaps foreshadowing the horror to come. Within just a few hours, a chain of tragedies would unfold, leaving families shattered and America reeling from a nightmare named Richard Baumhammers. First target, the innocent neighbor. Around 1:30 p.m., Richard left his house with a fully loaded handgun. His first target was his Indian-American neighbor, Anil Thakur, a kind and quiet man who lived just a few doors down. Anil was at home when Richard rang the bell. As he opened the door, a bullet went straight through his head, no warning, no explanation. Richard showed no hesitation. There was no personal conflict. Anil was simply not white. After shooting Anil, Richard returned to his own house and painted a swastika on his wall with red paint, a chilling declaration of the campaign he was about to unleash. Next stop, a mosque in Coraopolis. Minutes later, Richard drove to a nearby Islamic center, frequented by Pakistani and Muslim worshippers. He entered with his gun drawn and opened fire. Two men were shot. 29-year-old Imran Saeed died on the spot. Another man was critically injured but survived after emergency treatment. A witness later recalled that no one had time to react. Richard stormed in, fired his weapon, and left as if executing a pre-planned mission, merciless and cold. Next target, a Chinese grocery store in Scott Township. 10 minutes later, a Chinese food market was next. Inside, Ji Sun, a Chinese immigrant woman, was working at the counter, unaware that death was approaching. Without a word, Richard entered and shot Ji Sun at close range. She died instantly. A Korean customer was also seriously injured during the shooting. Fourth victim, Thai restaurant in Robinson. Around 2:20 p.m., Richard entered Yafei, a popular Thai restaurant. He opened fire, killing Tao Phan, a Vietnamese woman working there, and gravely injuring another employee. Surveillance footage showed Richard walking through the dining area, hunting for victims as terrified customers fled in chaos, some hiding under tables, others playing dead, and some never returning home again. Final victim, Jewish entrepreneur in Squirrel Hill. By 3 p.m., Richard stopped at the Squirrel Hill Community Center, home to a large Jewish population. There, he shot and killed Sunita Mazumdar, a Jewish businesswoman. She was about to leave her office when Richard attacked. This was the final shooting before police located and arrested him. He offered no resistance, no explanation. He still carried loaded ammunition. It appeared his rampage wasn't meant to end yet. A community in shock. In just over 2 hours, 5 people were killed, 1 critically wounded, and another lightly injured. All the victims were people of color. The pattern ignited outrage across communities and media outlets. Headlines blared across the country. Racist killer brings terror to Pittsburgh, immigrants in mourning, a day of blood in America. Hundreds gathered at crime scenes, bringing flowers, candles, and tears. Asian, Muslim, and Jewish communities organized memorials. That night, thousands of candles were lit, not only in remembrance but as a beacon of hope, to never let hate overpower humanity. An Indian American speaker at one vigil said, "We came here to live, to study, to contribute. No one deserves to die for their skin color or birthplace." After his arrest, Richard Baumhammers was detained in Allegheny County Jail awaiting trial. He was nearly uncooperative with investigators. During many interrogations, he remained silent, his gaze empty, as if his mind were somewhere far away. But his silence couldn't overshadow the rising public outrage. People demanded justice for the victims, whose names had become symbols of senseless racial hatred. A 40-plus count indictment. Prosecutors quickly filed over 40 charges, including 5 counts of first-degree murder, 1 count of attempted murder, 11 counts of aggravated assault with a weapon, 6 counts of hate crimes based on race, vandalism for painting Nazi symbols, multiple weapons violations. The state of Pennsylvania determined Richard would face a capital murder trial, meaning, if convicted, he could be sentenced to death by lethal injection. The courtroom battle, insanity or responsibility? From the outset, his defense team employed one strategy. They didn't deny his actions but claimed their client was severely mentally ill, specifically, suffering from paranoid schizophrenia. Defense attorneys argued Richard believed in a global conspiracy of foreigners infiltrating America to eliminate white people. He lacked the ability to distinguish right from wrong. Several psychiatrists were brought to testify. They confirmed Richard's history of depression, paranoia, prior psychiatric hospitalization, and his long refusal to take prescribed medication. One doctor stated, "In his mind, the shootings were acts of self-defense." He truly believed he was protecting the white race from genocide. Prosecution, he knew what he was doing. Prosecutors disagreed. They countered that despite his mental illness, Richard acted with full awareness and preparation. He made a list of targets before the attack, painted Nazi symbols to convey a political message, chose times when fewer people were present to avoid capture, attempted to flee after the shootings, rather than commit suicide. One prosecutor told the jury, he was a racist terrorist. There was no loss of control, everything was calculated. Verdict, death sentence. After weeks of intense trial, the jury unanimously convicted Richard Baumhammers on all counts and sentenced him to death. The presiding judge declared, "No words can erase the pain you've caused. But justice demands that society protect itself from those who spill blood out of hatred." In the courtroom, victims' families wept. Some had waited 2 years to hear this sentence. Debates over mental illness and the death penalty. Despite the sentence, the story didn't end. Human rights organizations and mental health advocates protested the execution, arguing, executing someone with a severe mental illness violates human rights. The court didn't fully assess his mental incompetence. He should be confined in a psychiatric facility, not executed. Meanwhile, many, especially the affected minority communities, felt the death sentence was the bare minimum for justice. If he's allowed to live, while our loved ones are gone forever, how is that fair? Richard now sits on death row at SCI Green Prison, Pennsylvania. He has repeatedly appealed, citing mental illness, but all efforts have been denied. The execution date remains unset. And the man who once terrorized an entire region now lives quietly in solitary confinement, speaking to no one, writing nothing, granting no interviews. As if he has sealed the final door between himself and the world.